Hello folks, and welcome to another video. In this video I'm going to be making the case that the Sony PlayStation 3 was actually perhaps the best console ever released. Now why am I making this case? Well, let's begin with the interface. It's attractive, it looks good. Even now, this interface is running at 1080p, but on a 4K TV, which obviously does its own internal upscaling and whatnot. And it still looks clean and simple and good, and it doesn't have like advertising thrown all over it, and it just looks good even today. Now, if we scroll down here, for example, you've got something that is you've got individual settings where you can for your PlayStation 2 games. You've got settings for watching Blu-rays, so that you don't have to do that each and every time. Some of these settings only just recently came to PlayStation 5, which is kind of strange. You've got separate settings for music, chat settings. You've got settings for everything on here, including themes, something that is very, for me at least, sorely missed from the PlayStation 5. Not being able to have themes, I think, is a really odd thing. So you've got tons of different settings on here to make this console your own, something that is not really so much the case on the later systems. You can store loads of photos on here. You can store tons of music on here as well. Loads and loads of music. Obviously, depending on how big your hard disk is. But I've got some music that I really love, for example, from DSX and Crimson Tide and Command and Conquer. You know, I'm quite into my games. You can store video footage on here as well, but obviously that'll take up a lot of room potentially. You had all the apps on here as well. And of course, tons and tons of games. Now, why am I saying that this is the greatest system ever then? Or potentially the greatest system ever? Well, alongside all of the different features and ease of use that the PlayStation 3 had, you also, this was before you really got tons and tons of microtransactions and season passes and all that kind of rubbish. Now, there was multiplayer passes and stuff in the games at times. But if you didn't play multiplayer like me, I didn't really play multiplayer. It wasn't really an issue for me. So you just have tons and tons of games, and you could just basically boot them up and play them. You could buy the DLC if you wanted for some games, but there wasn't all this season pass rubbish where essentially the game's not finished. Mass Effect 3 would be a pretty good example of that, but that came out right towards sort of the end of this console generation. But in general, if you bought a PS3 game, apart from a couple of glitches and some patches, you were probably pretty well set up. So what else makes this generation the best? Well, if you had an original PlayStation 3, you could even play your PS2 games on there on disc. And your PlayStation 1 games. Now, they all still play PlayStation 1 games, but the later models don't play PS2 games. But you've got all your favourite retro games on here. For example, Sonic Adventure, which I would argue is pretty much the best way to play this game, apart from maybe PC. All the Yakuza games are on here. You've got things like, excuse the volume, Metal Gear Solid. You know, the Metal Gear Solid 4 hasn't come to any other system since. You can play Nights into Dreams. So you've got all the Ratchet and Clank games on here, and no rubbish to go alongside with them. You've got Beyond Good and Evil, which is an incredible game. I mean, I'm not going to go through every single game on here, but the selection of games that are available on the PS3, just incredible, really. From so many generations of games, and thing is, now it's still online. You can still get these games for the system, and you can still buy them on discs, and they cost like next to nothing. Games like Sly Cooper, Thieves in Time, Puppeteer. This was also the last generation, I think, where it had really properly, like, truly original games on here that were sort of still breaking the mold and whatnot. And now it's just constant Assassin's Creed. There's Assassin's Creed Odyssey, Assassin's Creed Origins, Rogue, a new one set in Japan, Shadows. I'm sure it's a good enough game, but it's very safe. There's nothing really big and changing, and I know that can be difficult to monetize. Getting games out there where they might not make money and whatnot, and I know it's getting expensive to make games. And of course, there were sequels on PlayStation as well, but it's getting harder to see games like this coming out on the modern systems. And of course, this was also, apart from the PS4 maybe to a degree, this was the last generation where games actually weren't like crazy expensive. I mean, the most expensive games were like £50 unless you got a special edition or something like that. But for example, like I'll fire up a PlayStation 1 game, let's have something nice and quick we can get straight into. Ridge Racer Type 4. Now, it has to change the resolution, so you'll see something come up on the screen where it looks like classic sound. And then before you know it, you're into an excellent PlayStation 1 game. Now, what's another benefit of this system? Well, you can purchase one of these, stick an SSD in it, or just a normal hard disk, and you can have a mammoth amount of games on here. I'll skip this. Also, reliability was pretty decent on these. They did have some issues, but overall, especially if you buy the later Slim or Super Slim models, reliability was pretty solid. I mean, I've had this system, I can't even remember how many years I've had this system, a long time. I must have had this 15 years now, maybe a bit less, and it still works. Touch wood, it still works. So you can see these games, they load quicker and that as well, and they've got settings that even make them look slightly better, considering this is probably running at maybe 480p, but probably not, probably 280p. And yet, I can get into this, and it looks a bit blurry, you are talking about a PlayStation 1 game after all. You've had then PS2, and now PS3.
3, 2, 1, go!
But it fills the screen, almost, and it runs pretty much perfectly. And I remember when this game came out, I'm not so good at it now, I think I need to get better. But my point is, you can play these games, and they play just great. And they cost like next to nothing. Or you can even buy the original copies of the games, which unlike Sega Saturn N64 games, go for basically nothing. And you can then play them on here. And yeah, it's not the best looking game in the world, is it now? But the fact is, Ridge Racer Type 4 is still a lot of fun. So let's come out of this game and just have a look at another game or two on here to show you why I think this might be the greatest console ever, and why it's pretty hard for any other console to match up to this. So if I hold down the PlayStation button and I go to Quick Game, there we go, come out of that. And apart from the PlayStation Store, which is now pretty tough to use on the PlayStation 3, everything's fairly snappy on here. So I've got Metal Gear Solid HD Collection in there. But let's load up, for example, what should we load up? I mean, let's load up Jak and Daxter. So now you're talking about a PS2 game that has been remastered to come onto PS3, and a lot of these games even had 3D. Sony were really pushing 3D back then, but it didn't really take off. It's cumbersome, isn't it, to use, and oftentimes the 3D effects could impact performance, and also in a lot of games it didn't really add a great deal, so it wasn't really necessary. But I did enjoy it sometimes. I'd find if you were doing a mammoth gaming session, playing it in 3D probably wasn't really much of an option, to be honest. I feel like a lot of these things that come out for these machines is perhaps, I don't know, it's usually quite gimmicky. I think VR has some staying power, perhaps. And of course, this was before you had all these different options for 60 FPS modes and all this sort of thing. Now, I like all that stuff, but I know it's not for everyone, and for a lot of people, especially some of the ladies I know in my life, they're getting into these games and they're saying or they want to get into these games, but they're unsure what does the fidelity mode mean? What's the performance mode? What's 120 Hz mode mean? Why is there the option to run the game at 40 FPS? Oh, it's put it on 3D without me asking it to. That's annoying. I did say not to do 3D, didn't I? Right. Yeah. I don't know why it decided to put 3D on, even though I asked it not to. But there we go, 3D's off now. Just let me get back into this. So I thought the Jak and Daxter games were rather excellent games. Now the second one had some pretty annoying difficulty spikes in it, and so did the third one. That made it at times really frustrating and annoying to play. But overall, these were great games, and they really held up well against what Nintendo were producing at the time. And you can play them on here, and you can get them on disc still. And even if you weren't able to do the updates to them, for the most part, PlayStation 3 games, that was a bit rubbish. How embarrassing. Still work just fine. Most of them anyway, without patches. I wouldn't recommend probably playing Bethesda games on PS3. They weren't well optimised, and there was issues with the split pool of RAM on there, so sometimes they would just gradually get worse and worse performance, especially for like New Vegas. The performance would get worse and worse to the point where the game would actually just not really run anymore. But that's few and far between. Most of these games without patching would still play pretty nicely. So I'm showing you a PS1 game running on PS3. This is a PS2 game upscaled to run on PS3, and it runs great, 60 FPS. And of course, this was the first console to almost always get you 60 FPS, 5.1 surround sound as well. So let's have a quick look at a PS3 game, bearing in mind all the things I've said about how it is able to play all these games and for very little money. Now, sometimes you're not going to get like 60 FPS on it, but and here we go, there's even older games on here. This is the only place, to my knowledge, where you can play Daytona USA in HD, and I think that's so sad, because this is such a great game. In fact, I'll just show you this running as well. I know this video is getting a little bit long, and if you're still watching it, thank you very much, that is awesome. I'm sure you've seen PS3 games running anyway, but things like Metal Gear Solid 4, now it's not a solid necessarily frame rate all the time, but it is a really good looking game. It still looks pretty great today. Not a big fan of all the grey, it's not grey and brown everywhere, but that was a bit of a thing for this generation. Alright, let's get into this. Obviously I've got this on the Sega Saturn and that as well, but look how great it is. Look how great it looks and how great it runs, and that music. I just think it's really scandalous that this hasn't come to like PlayStation 5, where it could have run in sort of 4K and had extra options, and you could have played it online even. So I just think that's crazy. I mean, this takes me right back to playing this in the arcades and playing it on the Sega Saturn when it came home. And I remember coming from a Mega Drive or 32X and being like, this is insane. This is just, the graphics are insane, I can't believe this. I know it had some frame rate issues and draw distance issues, but you do have 40 cars on the track at the end of the day. But this plays incredible. And also, it bears talking about the controller. Yes, some people say it's a bit small, a bit light maybe. And obviously the DualSense is ostensibly a better controller. But I think Sony did pretty good with the DualShock 3. We honest. I've played a ton of games on it. The only issues I've found is that sometimes the tiny little springs that hold the triggers in can break or come loose. But it's fairly easy to take them apart and replace them with new ones. And Sony only put one in, but I put two in either side. Adds a bit more resistance to the triggers, but it also means they should probably last the lifetime of the machine, to be honest. Wow, I'm having a pretty good round, but I think I'm playing it on easy, so I can't brag too much. Look at Sonic up there. This is so cool. And this is only really, I think maybe you could get it on the 360, but if you get this on the PlayStation 3, the controller's great, it sounds great, you've got 4.1 with it, it looks brilliant, plays great. So you could have a go on this, you could play some Ridge Racer Type 4 or like Medieval, then you could jump into like Jack and Daxter, you could play Civilization on here, you can then jump into Final Fantasy or a little bit of Metal Gear Solid 4, and you've truly got variety. Also, I believe this system had about 4,000 or 5,000 games released for it, all of which, pretty much all of which, are available on disc. So you can just get these games and keep them forever. And these days, I don't think disc rot is much of an issue. Also, the games are incredibly cheap. I picked up Doom 3 recently, and it cost me, I think, with postage, £6. Now, yeah, Doom 3's come out on modern systems and that, and you know, it's a bit of a divisive game, but I think it's a brilliant game. And it plays 60 FPS on here with 5.1 surround sound. Yes, the resolution is higher on if you played it on PS4 version, but £6. I mean, can you really complain about that? I think that's an incredible deal. So those are my reasons as to why the PlayStation 3 might well be the greatest console ever made. And I'll quickly go over them again. Virtually all the games are available on disc. Collector's editions actually came with the game and not like some download code or something. The games were still reasonably priced. There was a huge amount of variety. Developers still took risks. Season passes and whatnot weren't really a thing, although DLC was, and to some degree of microtransactions were. Games didn't generally come out absolutely broken. You could more or less play them straight away out of the box. The games are cheap now. The console still works and is fairly reliable. You can replace the hard disk in it. The controllers are good and cheap and pretty durable as well. It will play well still on modern TVs, like 4K TVs and whatnot. As you can see, this still looks great on a 4K TV. You get your 5.1 surround sound, as well as the fact that most of the apps still work on here. And you can also put video on the system and music and whatnot as well. So it's a great way of backing up that stuff too. So those are my reasons why the PlayStation 3 might well be the best console on Earth ever. Now, of course, it's pretty fair for you to disagree with me. You might say the 360 was the best because a lot of the games came out on both. But sound off in those comments below. Let me know if I'm wrong. Tell me why you disagree with me, or if you agree with me. If you could like the video as well, that's great. Consider subscribing. Maybe check out my Patreon if you want. And if you could share this video on social media, that would be great as well. I want to thank you very much for watching this video, especially if you watch right up to the end, because I know this is quite a long one. And I hope you have a really great day. I'll see you in the next one.